everyone, and welcome to Seed Speaks. This is a video series brought to you by Seed World Group. My name is Mark Zinkowitz, and I am an editor with Seed World Group. And this month, we're talking with experts about the future of plant breeding. And today, I'm joined by three experts to discuss an important topic in the world of public sector research, and that's funding. We all know that funding is important, but I don't think we often understand the intricacies surrounding funding, how researchers get it, and what happens if things change and they have to sort of pivot and look for new opportunities. I'm joined by Brian Barris, who is an adjunct professor at the University of Alberta and an agronomy researcher at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Lethbridge. He's internationally recognized as an authority who develops integrated crop management tools and solutions to sustain the economic and environmental viability of farming systems in Western Canada. He recently shared the news that his winter wheat agronomy work was ending, and as a result, he had to pivot and explore other opportunities. Welcome, Brian. How are you today?
Doing well, Mark. How about yourself? Thanks
Not
for having
bad.
me, by the way.
Well, thank you for joining us. And I'm also joined by Gerald Singh Brar, who's a plant science professor and wheat geneticist and breeder at the University of British Columbia. Gertrude's lab is focused on studying production problems of wheat and barley in Canada. He studies genetics of trait improvement with an aim to develop improved pre-breeding germplasm for wheat breeders in Canada. His lab has actually started to actually breed wheat for Western Canada as well. Welcome, Gertrude. How are you?
Thanks, Mark. I'm good, and you? Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Gary Stanford is an Alberta wheat grower and a former chairman for the Alberta Wheat Commission. Welcome, Gary.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, as am I. Now, Brian and Gertrude, you both work, as I've noted, in the public sector, but in two different spheres. Gertrude, you're in academia, and Brian, you work, well, both in academia and on the government side. First, I want to give people an idea of how important funding is to what you guys do. Like, I think sometimes we think that researchers like you guys just kind of get funding for stuff, when in fact it's a lot more complicated than that, as you guys well know. Brian, I'm going to start with you because you actually kind of inspired me to do this episode of Seed Speaks. I was on Twitter and I saw your tweet about your winter wheat agronomy work, and I'm going to read from your tweet here. You wrote, and I quote, "It's the end of an era after 23 years of dedicated research by staff and colleagues. Our winter wheat agronomy work is shutting down after our proposal went down in flames. Looks like 2023 will be a review and reset of where we shift direction." Brian, can you just explain briefly what happened there and why that had such a big impact on you?
Well, I mean, winter wheat agronomy, like all the other facets of our program, as well as, every public researcher's program, relies on competitive funding processes to acquire the resources to do work that, our stakeholders have established as a priority. And we've been pretty fortunate with winter wheat, even though it's a minor class, it's been supported by folks like Gary, who are not just farmers but stakeholders within organizations that consider it an important area of work. This time around, though, we ran into it's never been easy with winter wheat because it's a bit of an orphan crop. It's not an easy thing to integrate in the minds of some farmers, so there's always that reluctance, and there's always been a problem with trying to get good traction of sustainable acres. So it dips up and down under 1 million acres, and that's a problem in itself. But yeah, we, as part of a federal funding program, we put it forward, thought we were, assured of going ahead with it, and we were surprised to find out that it was cut. And I think the impact, you asked about that. This isn't just the Brian Beres Winter Wheat Agronomy Show in Lethbridge. This is work where we have locations and collaborators across all three provinces, and quite often have stakeholders not just in addition to grower groups, but organizations like Ducks Unlimited, because winter wheat is that kind of a crop that, ironically, with the policy and emphasis on climate mitigation, is probably one of the crops best positioned to be used to tackle that. But it's kind of an irony that we got to that point of that sort of emphasis on climate mitigation, and that's the one time where it bit the dust. And so it's a bit of a lesson in continuity, I think. And breeding quite often makes a good case for getting continuity of breeding resources across federal funding programs and all sorts of different funding programs. But the lesson here is that if you don't have that same approach with agronomy, you're going to lose out, because it's not like we're necessarily looking for work as agronomy researchers, so it can be quickly replaced, and then where's winter wheat at? So that was the dismay, and kind of why I put it up on Twitter, which became a real popular one of my more popular tweets, for good or for bad. But I just wanted producer stakeholders, particularly winter wheat growers, to know that while you have a vested interest and it's your dollars at work, I'm not sure that this was communicated to you. So I don't think there was any other winter wheat agronomy actively being pursued outside of our proposal.
Yeah, thanks for sharing your experience, Brian. And it's going to sort of set the stage here for what we're going to talk about. And in Gertrude, I imagine you faced at one time or another the same challenge Brian's talking about, where you can no longer access funding for a certain project and you have to sort of pivot and review your priorities. Can you think of a recent instance, Gertrude, of something like that happening to you, and how it kind of impacted your work?
Sure. I will say in general, since I started at the University of British Columbia in 2020, I have been very fortunate to get support from producer groups, the grower organizations, that they funded my research program pretty well, and I'm thankful for their invested interest in my research program. However, I had one instance, just like Brian's, that I think was a bit disappointing, not only for myself but also my colleagues, when we were putting together a research proposal on barley genomics, applied genomics work for one of the federal funding opportunities led by Genome Canada last year. So barley is like the third largest crop in Canada in acreage, but this crop has never been funded so far by Genome Canada, unlike some of the other major crops in Canada. And there are still some knowledge gaps that barley industry and barley researchers feel should be filled with the genomics or applied genomics research. And unlike other major crops like wheat, lentil, soybean, we are lacking some of the resources or funding. And we were hopeful that we will get support from federal funding for that applied barley genomics research, but it was a bit disappointing. And in fact, our barley producer groups and industry was pretty supportive of our research ideas, and we are still happy and confident about whatever we put together, along with my other barley breeder colleagues and pathology colleagues across Canada. Answering second part of your question, like how we have to change priorities or what were our next steps, because some of these ideas are around knowledge gaps which we need to fill, and barley is a relatively smaller crop compared to wheat or other big crops, so the funding with producer groups may not be enough to fund all the research areas. So we are trying to recycle some of the ideas with some other funding opportunities, but definitely there are times when you think that government will realize how important one particular crop or value chain related to that crop is, but you often get disappointed, and that's what happened with us last year.
Now, Gary, having worked with a major producer group like Alberta Wheat, you've obviously dealt a lot with funding of research, determining research priorities, etc. In your experience, how does a producer group, for example, determine the research that it wants to fund? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's important for our audience to kind of hear the other side of that fence that we've heard from Gertrude and Brian about getting funding for their projects, and now you've been on the other side of that fence where you've actually had a role in funding and deciding which projects are going to be funded. How does that generally work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The Alberta Wheat Commission, the majority of the money we spend is spent on research. And so then we're like, okay, what priorities do we have? And so one thing that we started working on is the minor classes of wheat to make sure that they were getting funded. So like CPS wheat was getting pushed by the wayside. So we stepped up and said, okay, what do we need to do to support the CPS plant breeder in Lethbridge? Also the winter wheat plant breeder in Lethbridge. What do we need to step up and do? So we realized that there was a void becoming there as Ag Canada over the years has kind of stepped back a bit. And so there's the WGRF that does funding. And so we have board members from the Alberta Wheat Commission that are on WGRF, but there was still some voids in there. So we helped start the CWRC, which is a Canadian Western Wheat Coalition. And so with that starting, then that way we could help add money into the clusters so that we knew that some of the projects were getting funded properly. And, but still it seemed like there was more money going into the spring wheat and into the durum crops. So we said, okay, the soft white wheats, the winter wheat, CPS, hard white wheat, how can we help fill those voids? And so the farmers that, live in different areas of Western Canada, they're like, we grow winter wheat or we'll grow CPS wheat or we'll grow durum. And so there's different areas. And so it's important to some people, but not to everybody. As Brian mentioned, 1 million acres of winter wheat grown. But for those people that live in the drier areas of the Palliser Triangle, it's super important that, some of these, winter cereals get supported. So we've been a strong supporter of trying to make sure that there's no voids and that the money that the commissions take in is used on research and to work with, with Ag Canada and the WGRF. And so it is important to us. And we were sad to see Brian's program, get dismissed. So we're working on that, hard now. How can we refill this void?
Now, Brian, as I mentioned, you tweeted about having to reset and change direction. I'm curious about how you go about doing that. Like you say, your winter wheat agronomy work went on for 23 years. That's almost a quarter century. And then just kind of like that, just kind of came to this pretty abrupt end. How do you identify new priorities and then move on from that as a researcher?
You're making me feel old by saying I've been doing it for 23 years. And then that reminded me I became eligible for retirement last year. So, well, you have to be very strategic about it. And you start with signals from industry, I would say, on what, because I operate in a sphere of applied science as an agronomist, obviously. So what are the knowledge gaps? What are the constraints to production? What are the opportunities to exploit? So you've got feedback from growers in collaboration and communication with your commissions, producer groups, and other entities that are funded solely by producers. So that's one part of it. And and then of course, as a government scientist, you're doing research that supports government policy. So we would be, and we've been through iterations of this before, where agronomists, weed scientists, you know, shifted so that we could, you know, think of biofuels. There was a lot of canola agronomy, barley agronomy, triticale agronomy that we did in the 2012 era, 2008 to 2012 era, because the government had a big policy on work around biofuels, and so everybody shifted to that. But the work was still tied and still relevant to producers, because if it wasn't, that would be a really big issue. So that's kind of how you shift things about. And so you see where the opportunities are, you see where the knowledge gaps are, you look at, and I think more so than ever, Mark, I think what you have right now in Canada is a really good alignment of regional priority setting exercises that have been established through the commissions that align to national organizations like Cereals Canada, who then align their priorities globally with organizations like the Wheat Initiative. So I think there's more so than ever really good, transparent identification of priorities that you can link your research to, and also, you know, carry out the policy of climate mitigation within, you know, the federal government sphere as needed. So that, you know, that's the big thing. Then the last thing is, like, there's going to be times where you just, because of your experience or things you've encountered, you just have this concept that you think has merit. And we've done a bit of that. And a lot of times there isn't a lot of funding to start with. Like all the, you know, when I first started out, one thing that we were working on too on spring wheat was wheat stem sawfly, because it was such a production constraint when I started my program. So we ended up doing a ton of work in that area. Another concept I just sort of stumbled on by accident was, you know, shifting to ultra early wheat seeding, and that's really taken off and been popular. So there's sort of those, you know, multifaceted way about establishing and resetting, and that's what we'll do. We've got a lot of interesting things and been approached to do some work in barley, canola, multi-crop rotational stuff, and so on.
How about you, Gertrude? What's your take on that? How do you generally determine your priorities for research?
Sure. Yeah, like Brian mentioned, it really depends the region you are targeting your research at. My research is also very oriented towards application, even if it's a fundamental research. We always want to see an end application of our research. And pre-breeding is one of the strong components of my research program. And we work very closely with the cereal breeders, wheat breeders, barley breeders in Western Canada. And almost always our research priorities are aligned with the research priorities of these breeding programs, which is breeding for these priority diseases, which are production problems in Western Canada. And as we all know, Fusarium head blight is the top most and serious production issue when it comes to diseases. But other than Fusarium, the tree rust diseases and common bunt is also a problem. However, like I said, there are regional priorities set by producer groups. For example, stripe rust is not really that big an issue in eastern prairies, whereas it is in western prairies. Fusarium is a bigger issue in eastern prairies as compared to western prairies. So depending on what your goal is or what region you are targeting, your research priorities change. However, sometimes there are new production problems that we don't really are aware of, or we are not really working on. And one such example is black chaff disease of cereals caused by bacteria, xanthomonas, different pathomers of this genus that disease was usually limited to upper Midwestern plains of the U.S., North Dakota, South Dakota, Minneapolis, parts of Montana. And it's been becoming a problem, especially in southeastern prairies, southern Manitoba area. And there were also reports in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that is one disease on our radar, because like we all know, breeding and developing new cultivars takes about 10 to 12 years. So we have to be visionary in terms of what might become a problem. And also, federal government is pushing research on climatic issues or greenhouse gas emissions. So we are also working on some research areas where we can minimize or suppress nitrification in a biological way, by developing cultivars which can suppress nitrification in soil in a biological way. So that's another area of research. So like I said, we usually try to have a visionary approach, and we work with our other colleagues and try to set priorities for both breeding and pre-breeding.
Now, Gary, I'm curious, as a wheat grower yourself, someone who literally, grows wheat, and then after hearing what Gertrude and Brian have been talking about in terms of research priorities, like for you personally, Gary, what is the top priority in wheat research right now from your perspective, and why?
Well, of course, if those two would get me a higher yield, I'd be pretty hands up here with that. But in all seriousness, just what the two of them have mentioned, I mean, we're getting new diseases, new fusarium. We're getting new bug problems. Like how can we, the entomologists need to be important on this, and we're getting new kinds of wireworms in my one field there. I had wireworm problems, and the specialists come out from Lethbridge in a few minutes. They found 4 different kinds of wireworms. So, the breeding program needs to stay constant, needs to continue to get better. But I wanted to mention what Gershon was just talking about is that what's the future when he's doing this pre-breeding? What could we work on or support from the farmer organizations? Like, could we someday have a perennial wheat, or could we have a nitrogen fixing wheat? Like, what could we do for the future that we could support to, to have better quality wheats to grow as the world population grows? But I want to talk a little bit more about the concerns, I have with the agronomy part of this and with the program going down. Is that the federal government comes out and says, okay, we need to reduce our nitrous oxide usage by 30% with our fertilizers. So now with us losing our agronomy part with the winter wheat, is how do we do a better job of fertilizer placement reduction? So we have the 4 R's in place that are put forward by Fertilizer Canada, but we still need to do the work to see what will work and what won't work to maximize our yields. So the world and the federal government are constantly changing. So we're always adjusting our goalposts, where can we go with this? And then also with the winter wheat agronomy being closed down, I've had phone calls from farmers from across the prairie saying to me, Gary, what's going on? How come we're losing this? Winter wheat is a major part of my operation. Like, why wasn't this funded? And I've talked to the people from the WGRF about this, and they said, well, we're looking into it. We have to, dot all the I's and cross all the T's. So, and I think that's my responsibility, and the farmer's responsibility is to go to the federal or the research funders and say, why are these projects not getting funded? What happened to them? And where do we go with it? So, when we're putting a lot of money into it, the farmers are through the railway cap, through to WGRF, and then also with our levy monies we're paying to the commissions. I think this is super important that we go back to the organizations and say, where are we faltering here? Where are we missing out on? So I'm concerned, for the future of, if these funding programs don't go, is what happens to our winter wheat plant breeders or our CPS plant breeders, soft white wheat plant breeders, the smaller minor classes of wheat, where are we going in the future? So that's a major concern from us farmers.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I'll start with you, Gertrude, this time. In regards to funding opportunities, like I know there are different funding opportunities depending on if you're on the government side of things, if you're in the academic side of things. Gertrude, what are some unique funding opportunities that you have in academia that, let's say, people working, on the government side sometimes maybe don't have access to?
So in academia, we have an advantage to get funding from one of the tri-councils, NSERC, Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council. They have been funding university researchers for a very long time, and they have changed some of the funding programs over last 5-7 years. And as compared to NRC or Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada or any federal government researchers, we have advantage to get funding from NSERC. And we can also leverage funding given to us from producer groups or grower organizations with NSERC, and they have some really, really good programs. I must say, NSERC actually have some really good programs that they have launched in the recent past, which are really good and have been supporting us in a good way.
And Brian, on the government side of things, being with AAFC, are there some funding opportunities that maybe you have access to that people like Gertrude can't get?
Not really, to be honest. Like there's a bit of an irony there. As federal scientists, we can't access some of the federal programs like NSERC that Gertrude alluded to. And sometimes with some of these, we actually have more restrictions on what we can actually use the money for. So for example, salary dollars can be a real contentious one. We can't use it. We don't have the flexibility that our collaborators on the same project have that are from universities or affiliated there. One advantage with particularly agronomy within AAFC that we have over universities is our network of sites, right? So we've got 19 research stations across the country that at any given moment, when you have something of regional importance or that you want to scale across several different ecosystems, we can quickly and rapidly put together a network of sites that universities aren't necessarily as adept at, and that's why quite often we'll in a competitive framework we'll prevail, because we do have that ability, and so if we've got the track record also to do that, then we come out successful a lot of the time that way.
Now, before we sign off for the day, I just wanted to touch on something Gary mentioned earlier in regards to coordinating these things, and I'm curious how we might be able to improve things. Maybe can we be more aligned in terms of producer groups letting researchers know their priorities, and researchers letting producer groups and government know their priorities? I know that's a complicated question, but Gary, I'm just curious, in your personal opinion, are there some improvements that can be made in this regard so that people like Brian don't all of a sudden find out, oh, I'm not going to get funding for that after 23 years? Like, is there something in your view that we can do to kind of maybe improve things in that regard?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We are working with Ag Canada, which funds almost all the scientists, which I think is super important for the future of Canada. But like a lot of the research projects and the funding for the projects they work on, they come from the Western Grains Research Foundation and the CWRC, the Canadian Wheat Coalition. So how do we work together more? And so we do have directors from our Alberta Wheat Commission and Sask Wheat Commission that are on the WGRF and on the CWRC so that they can work together. So I'm not quite sure, like with the wheat clusters, can everything fit in the wheat clusters, or does some of it have to be done outside of the wheat clusters? Brian might be able to answer that question better. But the farmers, we want to make sure that there's not these holes that get dropped. So we need to understand why they got dropped by the research council on each one of the in each one of the funding. Why did it get dropped, and what was the purpose of it, or were they short of money, or did the money come into play? So it's a very complicated question, but I'll tell you that all the farmers that I'm dealing with and working with on the commissions, we're all very dedicated to making sure these holes filled.
Yeah, Brian, what is your take on that? What improvements can we make in that regard so that maybe someone like you doesn't fall into that again?
Well, like I commented earlier on how well I think priorities have been established and communicated. What I think maybe lacks is transparency in how the funding's allocated around those priorities, to make sure that whether it's a researcher that gets the letter they weren't expecting, or a farmer who's expecting some support in an area of research they feel is critical and lacking. I think that transparency and decision making lacks. And lastly, who's going to take on the priority? So if an entity says they have a priority, explicit priority in winter wheat, and they don't take that on, then I think there was an expectation that they do. And so prior to that, it would seem that there's a little bit of a lack of communication, or who plays which role. Does the wheat cluster do wheat only research and fund that? And that's the problem with agronomy, right? Because it rarely relates to a single crop phase. There's usually multiple components involved, integrated systems approach, blah, blah, blah. And so that really complicates things as far as who really wants to, participate and at what level. And so, yeah, I think the communication is paramount.
And Gertrude, I'll give you the last word. What improvements? How do you think we can make things better?
Sure. I think Brian and Gary have already said made some of the points, but yes, I think communication between producer groups and government, federal government, is very important to decide on some of the priorities, because the great thing about producer groups is they have set regional priorities, and they are grower organizations represented by actual growers, so they know the ground reality of some of the production issues that these growers are facing. And the other is, I think we shouldn't ignore some of the minor areas of research or very regional localized production problems, even though their impact might be smaller, but within that a small region their impact might be quite a bit. So funding commitment around these some of the so-called smaller issues is also very important.
Great discussion. Thank you guys for your time today. Good points, everyone. And thank you for joining me, Brian, Gary, and Gertrude. It was great to talk with you guys.
Likewise, Mark. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Good discussion.
Yeah, and that's all the time we have. I'd like to thank our audience for joining us today. Join us next week when Alex Martin tackles the topic of keeping your audience in mind while doing plant breeding research. This is Mark Zinkowicz signing off. Have a great day, everybody.